Today our talk is all about the United States public lands, how we use our lands, and what impact does that have on us as a society. So we're going to get started here with this concept called tragedy of the commons, which you all know about, where a commons is something that's owned by no one but used by everyone, and it has this land or ocean or part of our earth that's considered a commons, has a tendency to be shared, but it's limited, it has limited resources, and then because it's shared, it's basically works on a principle of first come, first serve, and you have a tendency to deplete the resources that are available in that land. So worldwide, we have lots of examples of overgrazing, using up our non-renewable resources, even population growth on land that's limited, deforestation, and overfishing. But we also have the problem here in the United States, right? When we're looking at using a small piece of land for several purposes, and so we have to have some kind of balance, and that's what our government tries to do with our public lands. In order to keep a population safe from destruction or safe from being depleted, we have to remember to use the concept of maximum sustainable yield. And by definition, maximum sustainable yield is the total number or the maximum amount of a particular species you can take without hurting its overall population. It's based on a mathematical formula. And to simplify it all, it basically comes out to about 1/2 the carrying capacity. So if you're looking at maximum sustainable yield, you take the carrying capacity, which in this case is K, divided by 2. That's the point at which, or the number of which, or a population at which you can take without hurting the overall population. Okay? So let's look at the lands of the United States, all right, overall, and how they're classified. We can go across the country, and you can see from this map very easily where most of the public lands are. Now, public land is land that's owned by a agency or by some form of government. The United States has 42% of all of its land publicly owned. That's the largest percentage than, or a larger percentage than any other nation on this earth. And of all that publicly owned land, the federal government is the single largest landowner. Our federal government owns about 600 million acres, or about 25% of the country. But if you look at this chart, you can easily see that most of the public land is in the western half of the country. In fact, 55% of the land is in the 11 westernmost states of the continental United States. So 55% of all of the public lands are in the western 11 states, and 37% more is in the state of Alaska. So if you take 55% of the land, it'd be very helpful if I had something that you could actually see. 55% of the public land in this section, all right, this is 55%. Alaska is another 37%. So you great mathematicians can figure this out when you're looking now at 92% of all public lands are in this western section of the United States. That's 92%. So east of that, we only have 8% of the remaining public lands. So you can see that there is a different set of considerations when you go to the western half of our country, where people don't own land privately, but rather that it's owned by the government. So let me just get through all this. And who is that government? Well, in the case of the United States, it's the Department of the Interior. The Department of the Interior is the one in charge of all of the lands of the United States. So let's take a look at some of these lands. We have our national forest, which is run by the National Forest Service. Okay. We have the Fish and Wildlife Service managing certain wildlife refuges, which we'll talk about coming up. And you can see those, very small amount, but you can still see them. and the Bureau of Land Management, which is taking care of our rangelands, and you can see where those rangelands are, again, in the western half of the country. All right, and let's start with those rangelands. All right, but before we get started with that in particular, just give me a minute to go back and discuss this whole idea of how we use our lands. Our public lands basically fall into three categories. Number one is called multiple use. And now multiple use means that the land itself is going to be used obviously for a variety of purposes at the same time. So this is to balance off all the different needs for that land. So it could be land that, say, if it's a forest, could be for wildlife protection, for habitat protection, for clean water, but also for logging and supplying timber for the country. All right, so there's a idea of taking all the resources and everything that's available on that land and using it. All right, now many times these purposes come in conflict with each other. For example, an area could be managed for its economic, the value of the timber, but it could also provide some scientific value, maybe even some recreational or aesthetic value. So cutting the timber comes in conflict with the scientific, recreational, and aesthetic. So there's got to be some kind of balance. So we come up with a second type, right, which I like to call moderately restricted. And now what we're talking about here are lands that you start putting on some restrictions to prevent those conflicts. So I call this based on the principle of conservation, where the conservation ethic, we like to call it, takes precedence. So you have a particular resource and a value of land, and that's basically trying to be balanced with human needs, but at the same time under the idea that that resource is valuable in its own right, has intrinsic value. So we call it moderately restricted. And the third type is the most restrictive of all. We just call it restricted use, or I like to call it restricted use. And restricted use is based upon the idea of preservation. And you're going to see this at the end of my little lecture here. Preservation means don't touch. So now we're talking about whether it's scenic beauty, unique natural habitat, or it could even be historic or cultural value. These are areas that we just deem too important and we cannot touch and use for other purposes. These are the ones where you can walk through, and that's about it. All right, so these are the three types. So now what we're going to do is try to keep those in mind as we talk about these different types of land. And you'll get to see how these basic principles come into play. All right, so let's get started with the first one, which is what we have here, which are rangelands. Now, rangelands under the Department of the Interior are managed by a section of the Department of the Interior called the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM. All right, and BLM stands for the Bureau of Land Management. All right, and they are the ones that basically regulate how much farmers can use this land. So already, almost instantly, we have a conflict, and that is that the I guess I should write this out. The Bureau of Land Management. Sorry. We have a conflict between farmers wanting to use the land for grazing and the government trying to preserve that land so that grazing can occur on it for years and years and years to come. So rangelands are grasslands, so that means that they don't get as much rain as a forest, if you remember your biomes. All right, and that this land is particularly susceptible to fires and other environmental disturbances. So if we overuse our rangeland, they easily lose their biodiversity and easily can lose their value as a land. So we have to look at these lands and take care and protect them. So one of the laws that was passed to halt overgrazing by farmers on public lands is called the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. So in this particular law, it's called the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. The Taylor Grazing Act basically was the first time that it provided a means by which the federal government could slow down grazing on public lands. So what it did was it converted federal rangelands, these ranges, all right, from a commons to a permit-based grazing system. So it took away the idea that the tragedy of the commons by taking away this land as a common property and making it instead by permit. So as a farmer, you can get a permit to graze so many cattle for so long on a certain piece of the land. Okay, so the Bureau of Land Management is probably one of the most controversial ones because of this conflict between farmers and land, and also it has some odd policies. You're supposed to try to keep under consideration that the rangeland managers need to protect and restore habitat, to preserve nutrient cycles, to make sure that the land remains in good condition, and at the same time provide this service to the farmers. But the regulations in the Bureau of Land Management do not require the involvement of a single environmental scientist. So basically it's done by politicians, which is in itself a major controversy. But that's the Bureau of Land Management. Let's take a look at what it has done in the past as we move forward here. All right, here's a great example of an area that is managed and mismanaged. You can see the difference between the two. Let me go a little more dramatic. All right, here you can see a fence drawn where in the near foreground the grassland has been managed by the Bureau of Land Management and preserved, while the background in the back was an area that has been grazed too much, overgrazed with cattle. And you can see the huge impact that has. And here are a couple more pictures of the exact same thing. So we need to balance these needs out. And that's what happens on our rangelands. One of the types of land that we deal with in our U.S. public lands. All right, what about our national parks? We all are familiar with national parks. We hear about national parks. Okay, the National Park Service, all right, the NPS, is responsible for maintaining our national parks. Our national parks are under the concept of multiple use. That we see our national parks as a value, but at the same time we also see it as a place for people to go. So our national park management plan includes the principle of multiple use. So they're set aside to protect specific habitats while at the same time providing services to the people. All right, and our national parks many times are set aside to protect ecologically sensitive and aesthetically beautiful areas that we have in our country. If you look at our national parks, you will see that most of them are so small they don't even show up on this map, and I'll show you why here in a minute. But you could see some of the larger ones out in the west, like Yellowstone up there in the north, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite. Okay, down in Florida you'll find the Everglades, and then of course in Alaska you find several national parks as well. National parks show our beauty, protect ecosystems, but also preserve historic and cultural parts of our country. So you see at the bottom right, Valley Forge National Park, right near us. Independence Mall is a national park. It's under the National Park Service. And also in the upper picture here, that's called the Dry Tortugas, which is part of the Florida Keys, which is a military fort down below Florida, and that's also a national park. So national parks are not just areas of ecologically sensitive, beautiful areas, but also our cultural heritage and historic heritage. But what are some of the problems that are happening with our national parks? We often hear about how beautiful they are and how we like to visit them, but what you don't hear is that our National Park Service is having trouble maintaining these national parks, and here's why. All right, there's several reasons. I'm going to give you some. No park exists in isolation by itself. Usually what happens, it's interacting with the spaces around it. All right, and what you have oftentimes is that the land on the outside of the park affects the inside of the park. All right, so you have development, okay, moving on the borders of the park. And what that does is it puts pressure on the ecosystem of the park itself. So that is one huge one. Related right to that is a second. You have invasive species coming into the park because of the development around the park. Many times these non-native species have an opportunity now to move in, and it could be like people's pets, imported plants, okay, that people put in their gardens around the house. In our national parks, there are more than 6,500 non-native invasive species. 70% of them are plants. All right, and it's feeling the pressure. They're all feeling the pressure from that. Also, our national parks are feeling the pressure from climate change. A famous example is Glacier National Park. May not have any glaciers in it in the next few decades. So as climate change melts away our glaciers, those particular national parks seem to disappear. There are many of these, by the way. We have air and water pollution. Our national parks are getting drier because the water is being pulled out of our national parks. All right, so there are water issues. And what I mean by that is the water that normally went through these parks, either through the rivers or streams, is being pulled for irrigation or for people in cities. Okay, a great example is the Everglades. Okay, there's a shortage of fresh water in the Everglades National Park, and that water is being pulled out for use in the major cities around there. Okay, or the other example would be the Colorado River Basin. The 10 national parks that are in that Colorado River Basin are seeing problems because the water from the Colorado River is being withdrawn for irrigation and communities down in the desert Southwest and along the coast of California. Okay, we also have air quality issues, air pollution coming into the parks and harming the trees. But I want to talk about two, or I guess the next one, which I think is the biggest of all, believe it or not, and that is that we love our parks to death. We are having too many visitors visit our park. Our parks are in need of repair, and there's no money. Our parks are being overcrowded. Okay, and now managers have to often balance the negative impact of people, too many people on a park, and the experience of being in the park. In other words, like for some parks, you need a 1 to 2 year wait before you get a reservation. And also people are coming in by the thousands every single day into the Grand Canyon, into Yellowstone, and using the park. We're almost loving our parks too much. And so we're having all kinds of problems. And the third one, which we're also going to get into, which also deals with visitors, and that is the big problem on national parks is the fact that there's too many people going to use it for snowmobiling, all-terrain vehicles, and things like that. These create noise pollution in our national parks. They destroy habitat. Okay, and people love to use these vehicles. This also includes any type of off-road vehicle. They love to use the parks for these vehicles because of the wide open spaces, but it is having a negative impact on the park system itself. So the park managers are having a hard time. So our national parks are governed by the National Park Service. Just remember that. And again, under the idea of multiple use. All right. So let's go to the next set. And that is called the National Wildlife Refuges. These are areas, all right, that are set aside, that are public land set aside for the primary purpose of protecting wildlife. And that's it. All right, so now what we're talking about is not multiple use anymore. All right, this is more for conservation. All right, the moderately restricted. So what we're looking at really here is the idea and concept of conservation. So it doesn't mean we completely restrict human access to these areas, but what we're doing is we're restricting it so that it provides a place for this particular wildlife an area for them to be protected and to allow a habitat for which they can use. Now, take a look at all these points in this map and find out where most of the wildlife refuges are. And if you look closely, you're going to see that many are along the shorelines, as you can see here. Okay, they're along our shorelines and along our waterways. So you can see that wetlands are as scientists look at it, are the areas that we determine to be the most valuable. Therefore, they're the ones that need to be protected for wildlife. So we talked about wetlands before, and we need to understand that these wetlands are so important, and you see that on here. Now you also see something that's kind of unusual. You might have noticed a huge number in the central part of our continent. And the other thing we have to realize is not only is it waterways and wetlands, okay, but it's also migratory routes, where animals that migrate have a higher tendency to become endangered because we have to protect many habitats as they migrate. And so wildlife refuges do that. There are several wildlife refuges along the New Jersey coast. There's the two main ones, which is Cape May and then also Brigantine, New Jersey. And those are two migratory stops for many birds that go up and down the East Coast. We have one also in southeastern Pennsylvania right here, the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, and that's right at the end of the runway of the Philadelphia Airport. So there's a large wetland there, in which is a wildlife refuge. So these wildlife refuges are under this idea of conservation, under the idea of moderately restricted use. People can still visit them. You can still actually drive on many of them. But they are set aside for the purpose of protecting wildlife. So you got a tremendous opportunity here. Now the top one obviously is a wetland. The bottom one is one you might have heard of before. And hopefully you have some concept of this. Anwar in northern Alaska, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. And it's the calving ground for the caribou. Okay, that's the controversy where, do we open it up for drilling for oil, even though it's considered a wildlife refuge? Or do we keep it more for the protection of the wildlife? And that's an issue that is highly debated. In amongst these wildlife refuges are the last set of land, public land, and these are areas that are designated. Now they could be forests, they could be grasslands, they could be wetlands, but these are areas known as wilderness areas. Okay, wilderness is set aside for one reason only, and that is to protect the natural land. It's under the idea of preservation, what's called restricted use. All right, wilderness areas are set aside for total preservation, which means that you cannot have motor vehicles. All right, so these are called many times in a law, actually in a law that was signed in the 1990s, they created something called the roadless rule. The idea is that in a wilderness area you are not allowed to build a road, so that means we can use that concept to limit human use of the areas. Okay, so what we're trying to do is preserve large tracts of totally intact ecosystems or landscapes. Okay, so mining, logging, building, construction, all that kind of stuff is off limits. The only thing you can do probably over a wilderness area is either hike or fly over it in an airplane. We don't have a whole lot of land designated as wilderness. You can see in the map here that the percentages are very small. Up in the northeast part, we only have 0.23% of our acreage designated as wilderness land. But we do set this aside as total preservation for future generations. Okay, and that takes us to the final note. That is that this land that we have here in the United States is set aside for many uses, but it's the public land that the federal government and Department of the Interior has control over, and they try to balance human needs with natural needs by setting aside lands for a series of different purposes. Okay, and that those lands, through their designation, give us some concept of how we want to manage our land. The last thing is a law I want to show you that was put together called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. All right, it's the National Environmental Policy Act. All right, this was put together right around Earth Day. All right, and the important thing with this is that it requires any time on any of these public lands that we talked about today, on any of them, it requires any developer, for any reason, whatever the purpose is, that they put together an environmental impact statement. It's called an environmental impact statement, where they must, on all public lands, put together a report that talks about the impact of that development on the natural environment and suggest any alternatives to their project, all right, and analyze the total impact of each alternative. And then that report must be given to the federal government, who then uses that report to decide whether or not your particular proposal can go through. All right. Oftentimes they'll submit, they'll be required to, from the federal government, to submit an environmental mitigation plan, all right, stating how they will address the project's environmental impact. So if they see that there's, through their environmental impact statement, or EIS, sometimes it's abbreviated, that if there is going to be an environmental impact, the government's going to come back and say, all right, we need an environmental mitigation plan. How are you going to address this particular issue? And especially things like taking up habitat of an endangered species, or destroying a wetland, or taking away important rangelands and things like that. So that takes care of most all of our public lands, except for one, which we're going to spend time in the next lecture, and that is our national forest. But that's for another time. Thanks.